Yeah.
Okay. Josephus was a military officer in the mid-century, mid-first century, and about 67 A.D. or so, as the Romans were coming down because of the revolt that was taking place, that the Zealots were trying to pick a fight with Rome, and they got it. And as they're coming down to the north towards Jerusalem, they stop off and they raze to the ground basically most of what's in the north, and there's a gigantic naval battle on the Sea of Galilee, and Josephus is captured. And being an educated man and a guy gifted with talk, he was able to talk his way into a pretty good position with the Romans as a captive, and he basically wrote the history called the Antiquities of the Jews, and the Wars of the Jews, and both of these volumes were to help Rome to understand why the Jewish people were the way they were, why they would never allow Rome to have peace as a conquering nation. And in his, in fact, I think I put Antiquities up here on the board, but I think it's probably in the Wars. He writes about how Herod the Great died in explaining the history of the Jews. Now, when Herod died, as you know, Herod was a wretched individual. And at the end of his life, he was a wretched human being. And he suffered greatly. His body fell apart with disease. And he had one of his palaces in the old, it wasn't in the Old Testament town of Jericho, but the New Testament. There was actually two Jerichos right there next to each other. And in the New Jericho, the New Testament Jericho, he had a palace that straddled one of the wadis coming out there by Jericho, and that's where he died. But by his own decree, in his will, he wanted to be buried at this place called the Herodium that we'll talk about in a minute. But Josephus talks about it. He says, Herod was born upon a golden bier studded with precious stones of various kinds and with a cover of purple over it. The dead man, too, was wrapped in purple robes and wore a diadem. A diadem can be like a headband, or it can be a crown. I take it to be a very fancy golden headband because of the next line, on which a gold crown had been placed, and beside his right hand lay a scepter. And then where you see the ellipsis there, there's a rather long description of the entourage that went from Jericho to the Herodium, which was about 7.5, 8 miles south of the old city of Jerusalem. Basically the entire army in going to battle in their formations marched with Herod's funeral procession. There was about 500 servants and slaves that were a part of it. I mean, it was just a gigantic entourage that marched his body down to the Herodium, for it was there that the burial took place by his own order. And so Herod the Great, he died in 4 BC in Jericho. He was buried at the Herodium. The Herodium was a project that he began in 25-24 BC. It's a commemorative place for him. The site became very important to him. We'll talk about that in just a second. But in building it, there was an upper Herodium and a lower Herodium. The upper Herodium was up on top of a really high hill. The lower Herodium was the structures down there at the very bottom. Ehud Netzer, who was a very famous archaeologist, died about 2010. He spent most of his professional archaeological life, teaching and researching, but for about 30 years of his professional life, he was really dedicated to trying to find the tomb of Herod at the Herodium. And about 2007 or so, he discovered, a couple of years before he died, he discovered a large tomb with rich and ornamental sarcophagi. There were 3 coffins that were found there. They were very opulent, very ornamental, obviously belonged to someone with a lot of wealth. Whether or not any of those 3, probably not, were the sarcophagus that Herod was buried in, but this is probably right in the area where these royal burials would have taken place. The Herodium continued to exist even after Herod, even during the time of Jesus, even after the time of Jesus. The Zealots took it over during that Jewish revolt in which Josephus is writing about all of this to the Roman army. But as soon as the fall of Jerusalem takes place in 70 AD, they know that there's no way that a small fortress palace like this is going to be able to withstand the Roman army. So they basically leave the Herodium and head down to Masada, where the Romans are going to chase them down and end it in 72 A.D. It was captured once again by the rebels during the revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba. You'll remember that Israel was a place where messiahs were expected. And if you didn't believe that this was the Messiah, then maybe this was the Messiah. And I mean, it was even true with Jesus, even though by the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion had taken place, I mean, the church had been around for about 100 years. There were still those in Judaism that believed that the Messiah was still to come. There was one by the name of Simon Bar Kokhba. The word ben in Hebrew means son of. In Aramaic, bar means the exact same thing. So if you see Bar Kokhba or something, it always means son of. And the word Kokhba or Kokhba is the Hebrew and Aramaic word for star. In Numbers 24, verse 17, you have that oracle that's given by Balaam. And in verse 17 of Numbers 24, he talks about a star marching out of Jacob. And so the word Kokhba or star became a messianic designation. In fact, there was the Nazareth group with the Netzer, the branch that's found in Isaiah. That was a messianic community out of which Jesus was born. But there was also where the Jordan River and near where the Jordan River and where the Sea of Galilee meet there on the south side, there was another messianic village by the name of Kokhba, and it was a messianic, and they called it Star Village. But he was considered by some that did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah to be the Messiah about 100 years after the time of Jesus. And he was, he got holed up in the Herodium, and that's where he came to a very bad end of his life during that period of time. The site was abandoned about the 9th century, and there was very much about 10 centuries of dirt that landed on it, which takes a long time to uncover when you're going slowly and with modern archaeological techniques. It takes a little while to get that dirt off, but that's when it really, that's when it was really abandoned, and it, this really beautiful place. It was a gorgeous place, and it was considered to be one of the 3 great palaces in that part of the world. And so by the 9th century, it's become a ghost town. So going back to why it was built, if you look at the city of Jerusalem and you go south towards the Dead Sea, a little bit to the southeast, about 7.5, 8 miles, you're going to find the Herodium. You can actually see it from Bethlehem, which is about 7 or 8 miles south of Jerusalem as well. But in 40 BC, the Romans have promised to Herod that they will make him king of Judea if he can drive out the Parthians. The Romans and the Parthians were always at each other. His first attempt was not successful, and so he had to get out of the country, and he stopped at that site where the Herodium was built to leave his mother and wife while he went to Rome for reinforcements. He comes back. He beats the Parthians out of the Middle East. Rome is happy with him. He becomes king to celebrate a successful rearguard action. And what happened is, there was a remnant of his army that made sure that his mother and wife were safe in that area while he went to Rome to celebrate the safety, his soldiers, all of that. He builds this beautiful palace called the Herodium, beginning about 25-24 BC. And after building the Herodian fortress, Herod's men then conceal it from view by moving tons of dirt from the mountain to the east of it. So they take the top of this mountain and transport it to the top of this mountain to cover the palace all the way around with dirt, which made it nearly impregnable. And if you'll see in just a minute, I mean, it's going to get overrun, but it's going to take, where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, the Romans were able to overrun Masada after a year of building that siege ramp. This is not nearly as high, not nearly as big, but when you cover something with dirt, and it's just dirt, you're not going to be able to burn it very easily. And if you make it very, very steep like this is, and there's only a path where maybe 2 to 3 men shoulder to shoulder can march up it, it doesn't take a whole lot of men on top of that mountain on the embankment wall to be able to rain rocks and arrows and weapons and all that, ammo down on top of these guys to decimate the army. But this is what it would have looked like before. There would have been a top on this mountain right here as well, and this one would have been a little bit flatter. But Herod, just was a man who was able architecturally to get things done, was able to get his men to move this top of this mountain over here over to here. And that's what it looks like today as you're driving from the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, where Jericho is located, where the Jordan River comes into the Dead Sea, and you turn back to the west and you're heading up Jerusalem, up the hill, you'll see this off in the distance, and that is the Herodium. And that's what it looks like from a drone. There's a circular top, there's a circular embankment wall. There are 4 towers. This tower actually is the only one that's round. These 3 towers are all half circle. This tower right here would have gone up another 3 stories. It's about 50 feet in diameter. The embankment wall right here would have, you would not have had to have a whole lot of soldiers up on top of it to defend it. As you can see, the path is not all that big, and I mean, you barely breathe on a boulder and it's going to go rolling down and it's going to take out a lot of people. But as you can see, here's the main entrance. Very, very small and easily fortified. There was a monumental staircase that went down this way like this that was put there later. But there was a theater here. The lower Herodium area is down in here. And in this area right here was where most folk, according to Ehud Netzer's findings, believe that Herod was buried. This is what it looks like. I mean, you can see how, it is not gigantic. Not much acreage up there, you can say, by the scale of the people. This is about 50 feet wide. It would have gone up 3 stories. It would have been a place where there would have been living quarters. So here, this is the east tower. This is east. This is north. This would have been the direction right here towards Jerusalem. Bethlehem would have been in this direction. These right here would have been towers of living quarters as well. This right here would have been Roman baths that Herod would have loved. We'll see a picture of the inside of it, called Herodium. This right here would have been some living quarters as well. And this would have been a synagogue after the time of Herod the Great. And then here's the entrance right here, and this would have been a portico with columns. It would have been open air. There would have probably been lots of plants. It would have been a beautiful place to receive people. And then there's all kinds of tunnels and things like that that are underneath this palace mound right here. This, if you go back, this is that Roman bath. And this is what it looks like. And what you see here is some stone pedestals that would have put this stone and mortar floor, would have been the base for it. Fires would have been lit down here. There would have been water, possibly, and sometimes they're water, sometimes they're dry. But the heat from the floor, from the fires, would have heated the pool. If they wanted it to be more of a dry sauna, the steam and everything would have gone through these pipes right here. It would have heated the walls of the room, and then the heat itself would have gone up through through the chimneys. But as you can see, kind of an ingenious way to live. If you wanted a whirlpool or a sauna, you had both of those, and the mosaics here are absolutely stunning. This is a part of a picture that was found. I showed you the picture of the theater where Herod had a royal box. This was taken from, this piece was found in what would have been Herod's royal box. Down at the bottom, there would have been a long palace, a long rectangular palace. There would have been a race course for horses that would have been the length of the palace right in front of it. Then as you go off back to the west, there would have been some different kinds of monumental buildings, as well as a very beautiful garden and pool area. But this was taken from the theater, and most scholars Nobody really knows for sure what this is a painting of, but what they guess it is a picture of the naval battle, the victory of the Roman Navy at the Battle of Actium, I think, which was about 40 or 41 BC. And then this right here is a replica model of the marker for Herod's tomb. And as you can see, the top of the mountains up here, this is very, very steep. You can see how the path it winds around it. There are some switchbacks and some things like that. But the theater would be down in here, and Herod's tomb, they believe, even though they've not found the definitive place, this is a royal burial chamber, very affluent, very opulent, coffins inside of it. They believe this is the place, and because of this monument that would have been there, they believe this is the place where Herod was buried. And this is a view of it from the other side. Qumran. The Herodium, is not mentioned in the Bible, but there has been some of the commentators, and I'm really ambivalent on it. It's possible, but I just don't think so. When Jesus in Mark 11 and Matthew 17 is talking about prayer, he says, if you just have a little bit of faith, you can say to this mountain, get up and go on top of that mountain. And there are some of the scholars that think that the Herodian was kind of the thing that sparked that illustration or that teaching on prayer by Jesus. Is it definitive? I don't think so. Is it likely? Perhaps, but probably not. Because Jesus is talking about faith, and what happened at the Herodium was done by men. But again, it may have, it was such an audacious thing that that's the point that Jesus is making. When you pray, have faith that God is powerful enough to do whatever it is that you're asking Him to do. Now, this brings us to Qumran. Qumran is not mentioned in the Bible. The people that live there are not mentioned in the Bible. But it is guessed by most folk that most folk in the know, probably 90% of them, believe that the Essenes were the ones that lived at Qumran. Going back to Josephus, that wrote about the wrote to the Romans the antiquities of the Jews and the wars of the Jews to explain the Jewish nation and culture and their religion to the Romans. It is believed that the people of Qumran they made their community were known as the Essenes, which were part of the 4 philosophies of Judaism that Josephus mentions: Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and Essenes. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered there. That's one of their huge. That is their importance. There's a lot of antiquity. There's a lot of archaeology. There's a lot of the ancient world. But by far, head and shoulders above everything else that Qumran does for the world, the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 47 and 1956, from 11 caves, has given us so much understanding of the manuscripts which form our Bible that we did not know, not even a century ago, even existed. I mean, it is unbelievable the impact that these scrolls have had. The first discovery was by this kid, a 17-year-old kid. He's a Bedouin. He is a guy herding goats. He's 17 years old, Mohammed Ed-Dib. He's searching for a lost goat. He's got a couple of cousins with him, and they're in this area of Qumran with their clan and with their tribe and their animals, and he loses one. And he sees this cave, trying to find this goat, going after to get the goat. It's a precious commodity for the clan. He throws a rock into the cave, and he hears something break, which catches his attention. He goes and tells his cousins. They go back home the next day, after talking about it at night and going, you know what, we're poor. There might be something in there. We know this, the Jewish people, all this kind of stuff. There might be some treasure in there, and our days of being shepherding goat herder boys, will be done. So they go back the next day. They climb into this cave, which in and of itself is a feat. I mean, it nearly have to be Spider-Man to be able to get into this cave. And he discovers when he goes in there, the floor of this cave has all of these shards of pottery, and there's all of these jars that are lined up against the wall. and he begins to open up all of these jars, and all that's in them are these rolled up scrolls. Just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. They're fragments. It's all this old writing, and he's disappointed that he doesn't find anything else in there except these scrolls. But they may be important to somebody. So they take 3 scrolls back to their chief clan. They decide, they're there. In fact, one of the stories is that these scrolls were laying next to a wood-burning stove for a couple of days while they were deciding what to do with it. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, just up in smoke. Well, there's antiquity dealers going all the way back to this period of time in Bethlehem. They take it to a guy in Bethlehem. He thinks they're stolen, so he says, get away. They take it to another guy because they're persistent. He sees them for what they are, and he buys all of them. There's an American professor there who gets wind of it as well. It creates a chain of events that brings an archaeological team into this area of Qumran, and they begin to search out those 11 caves, and they find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of important scrolls and thousands and thousands and thousands of fragments. Now, the impact on the Bible is this. Prior to the time that Ed Deeb found the Dead Sea Scrolls, our Old Testament was based on the Masoretic text, which dated about 900 AD. So it wasn't really all that old. People wondered, well, is it accurate? All of a sudden, you have an Isaiah scroll that goes back to 100 BC. In 1947, they find a manuscript of Isaiah that is 1,000 years older than the one that we were using to put together our English Old Testament. And between the 100 BC Q Isaiah and the 900 AD, we're talking about 1,000 years difference in those scrolls, there were 13 letters that were different. The book of Isaiah is 66 chapters. I mean, you can't count all the letters in it. And between that Q Isaiah and the Masoretic text, 1,000 years of people copying and making sure they're keeping it straight, there were 13 letters that were different. They begin to put these scraps together, the fragments together. There were 11 caves that they found all of these jars in. The first one that they found this Isaiah scroll in and the one that they were looking for the goat is known as Cave 4. And it is nearly all of Isaiah. And the people that populated Qumran, again, nobody really knows who they are. Most people think it's the Essenes. But about 150 BC, and this is the Hasmonean period, you'll remember this is where Hanukkah comes from. There was a fellow known as the teacher of righteousness that led a group of Jews who were disgruntled with what was happening in Jerusalem out into the desert. And the reason they're disgruntled is because the Hasmoneans, who you'll remember, they're the ones that fought the Seleucids back into Syria. They recaptured Jerusalem. They got the temple. They rededicated it and consecrated it and gave us the Festival of Lights, or what we call Hanukkah today. But besides, military victories, they usurped some positions that biblically, according to Old Testament, Torah was not theirs. The Levites were the ones who were supposed to take care of the temple. The Hasmonean family had taken control of the high priest's office and the priestly duties of the temple, although they were not of the proper lineage. And so there were folks, and the Essenes were some of them, that said, you know what? This is not making God very happy. We better get out of Jerusalem. And that's how they ended up out in the desert next to the Dead Sea. The Qumran community was committed to the scriptures and are generally believed to be the Essenes, considered to be kind of a holiness movement. They were committed to not only knowing the scriptures and memorizing the scriptures, but also copying them. And I mean, just the work that they did in copying these Old Testament passages, as well as their own, the manual of discipline and all of that to be a member of the community of Qumran. It was so revealing of what was happening during this period of time. About 31 BC, there was an earthquake, and Herod the Great gave the Essenes a piece of the Jerusalem upper city where the Hasmoneans once resided. And they were given this piece of land, and it was not very, very big, and there is still a lot of debate as to exactly who was there. But you'll remember that passage that we talked about last week in the sermon and last week in class, where Jesus gives instructions about the preparation of the Passover, and he talks about a man carrying a bucket. It is believed that that was probably an Essene, because carrying a bucket of water that was children's work, that was slaves' work, that was a woman's work, and for a man to carry it, that meant that he was of some different ilk. And the fact that it was in the upper city, many believe that he was probably an Essene, and the place where the Lord's Supper was instituted was in that Essene area of Jerusalem. That even though they had moved out of Jerusalem, there was a small group that had stayed behind. The Qumran community believed that they were in the days of judgment, that the end of the world was imminent. They had lots of different ways that they referred to themselves. They were the elect, the saints of the Most High, the sons of light, the holy people. They lived a very ascetic kind of life, vows of poverty, that kind of thing. They were the study of Torah was essential to community life. And it was very difficult to become one. I mean, you just couldn't show up and say, I've got X number of dollars, I'd like to buy a club membership. If you were a man, you became a member of the Qumran community by being interviewed by the shepherd. If you passed that examination, you were a member of the community for 1 year on probation. You were not allowed to go through the ritual baths. You were not allowed to be a part of the communal meals. But you were learning what it meant to be an Essene in that community. At the end of that year, you went through an examination by the group called the Many. And if you passed that, then you were on for a second year where you were allowed to give all of your goods in trust to the Essene community. You were still not allowed to do the mikveh baths or the ritual cleansings or the communal meal, but you were still participating in life. At the end of that second year, if you passed the examination, then you became a full-fledged member, and all of your goods became the property of the Essene community there at Qumran. Two principal community rites were the ritual baths and the mikvahs that we talked about at the bottom of the monumental stairs on the south end of the temple, and the communal meals. Some scholars believe that John the Baptist was a part of this community, mainly by the way that he dressed and the message that he preached. They thought that the end of the world was near. The axe is laid to the root. He brings his winnowing fork, fire, repentance, baptism, all of these kinds of things, plus the very sparse way in which he dressed, led some scholars to believe that John the Baptist was a part of this community. I don't really go in that direction. I think that John the Baptist was an individual called to live that life because of Elijah, who he came in the spirit of. Now that's K4. That's where it all started. That's where this kid thought his goat had gotten in there. And he threw a rock, and it sounded like a window broke. And he did like what other kids do, ran, And then when they thought about it, he said, well, what would be in there that would break? Well, maybe it's treasure. So they go back the next day, and they find the Dead Sea Scrolls, or what begins. And as you can see, there are just caves all over the place. Going back here, Cave 4, I believe this is Cave 4B. Cave 4A is in this little indention right here, and this is Cave 10 up at the top. So I mean, there's all these caves. Obviously, they're natural, but they've been enhanced by men, probably the Essenes, for the storage of goods. But you can see, they're just caves all over this area. To date, there are 11 caves that have been investigated and explored and searched for these manuscripts. And this is where the community was. As you can see, it's a very, very stark, sparse area that was fitting of the kind of august lifestyle that they would live. There's a picture here we'll have in a second where, they're not that far from the Dead Sea, and you can actually see more of the beauty of the area that they were living in that particular picture. This is the scriptorium. The scriptorium, this place would have been filled with men hunched over tables and manuscripts and just copying and copying and copying and copying and copying over all of the years that community was there at Qumran. And this is a mikveh bath. This is a baptistry for the Qumran, the Essene community, and very similar to the ones that you'll find at the foot of the monumental steps going up to the Hulda gates going into the Temple Mount. But basically, a guy would go down into the water, he would immerse himself in the water, and he would come back out. Now, to show you just how serious they were as a group of people dedicated to honoring God and God's word and all these kinds of things. So they're in that scriptorium that we, elbow to elbow, copying these manuscripts. When they came to the 4 letters, the tetragrammaton is, you may read about the tetragrammaton. The 4 letters in Hebrew, they refer to God's name. The Yod, the He, the Vav, the He, and the Vav. We pronounce it Yahweh. When they came to that word in the script that they were copying, before they wrote the name of God, they would strip down and they would go down into the water, baptize themselves, come up, write the word God, which basically, again, it's just 4 letters, and it would look like this. Yod, He, Vav, He, Yahweh. They would write those 4 letters with pen and ink, and then they would go and rebaptize themselves. And then they would get back to copying. So you get to those texts where, and God said, and then God did this, and then God said, and then, he said to God, and then God said, and then he said to God. I mean, these guys are baptizing themselves, just all the time, and trying to honor God in the way that they were copying these manuscripts. And you can imagine, at the end of the day, they were pruned up and, probably had a hard time holding on to the ink and to the pen and the ink that they were using. But there are these mikveh ritual baths, baptistries, there in the Qumran community. This is the kitchen. I believe that there is an oven right here. You can't see it from this picture, but there's it doesn't quite look like a pizza oven, but look, it's a big rock that has a hole that was cut into it. It was heated from the bottom, and they would put the breads and everything on the floor of that rock where the hole was. And you see, grinding stones right here. And because the Qumran community was probably fairly decent in size, they had a pretty big dining room and a pretty good sized kitchen. And this is looking back to the east. This is the Dead Sea. And you see, you're really not all that far from the Dead Sea and the eastern side of the Dead Sea over there, which would have been Moab. But the color blue is just stunning. They're date trees. And then you can see the longhorn in the cistern. And what was really funny, I'd been there, I'd never seen this before. And so we're going back to Qumran, and it's not that big of a sight. And, but then our guide, who is a Messianic Jewish Christian and has never lived anywhere else in the world except Israel, but he has been doing tour guiding for so long and doing tours for so long that he had come across some University of Texas tea sippers. And so he knew all about the University of Texas Longhorns. And so Wayne and Jordan and I and the rest of our group are from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We're kind of, it's the heat of the day, and, we're getting ready after this to go into Jerusalem. And all of a sudden he says, how many of you here know Texas Longhorns? And that got our attention. And he goes, God loves the University of Texas Longhorns. And he showed us that. And I said, I knew God loves a tea sipper. But this is a cistern, and that's just plaster, and the way that it remained up on the wall after all these centuries, you can see the longhorn in it. And I mean, everybody had a great laugh and all of that. We loved our tour guide. But that is it. And so we'll let you go. What time is it? 46? I'll let you go a little bit early. The museum of the book. And it's shaped like the jars that the scrolls were finding. It's a really cool looking museum. And you go in there and you're actually looking at these scrolls that go back, 2,000 years. And it's really amazing to see not just the dexterity, but the clearness of the script. And some of it is minuscule, that you cannot read unless you have your glasses on. And to me, the technology that they had in terms of being able to create ink that lasts that long, as well as the pen tips that could get that fine and that small, and then the methodology that allowed them to go so slow and for it to be such a reverent thing. I mean, how many times would I have to baptize myself before I said the word God in a sermon? I mean, they were constantly being reminded that this is about God. This is information. This is God's word. This is revelation. This is inspiration, the Spirit, and all of that. And they took, in their methodology, they took such care that in 1,000 years of these manuscripts being copied, that there was only 13 letters different between the Masoretic text, what we had, and then finding these that go all the way back. That the oldest known manuscript in Israel, when these were found, was known in Palestine, was 900 A.D. And to find one that was only 13 letters different, but it was 1,000 years prior, gives you a lot of confidence in the way that Bible, that Old Testament has been put together. And to go and to see all of those, what they allow you to see of those scrolls is really, really amazing. What's really sad, though, is that there's so much that still needs to be done. By 1960, they have basically found what they have found, from 46 to 57, they have found the scrolls. But by 1960, they have become so politicized that there was just stuff, because of the political nature of it, there was a lot of stuff that has not even seen the light of day. Because people saw it as a way to become famous, to make a name for themselves. You translate. I mean, there were guys that were getting their PhDs by being given the opportunity to translate something that had into English that had never been translated or seen before, and to become the expert on a piece of parchment, this big. You were making a name for yourself. There was a claim. There was money to be made. There was publishing to be made. There was who's going to get the credit and all of that. And it became so politicized that there is still just mounds of scrolls that need to be translated that would continue to help us to understand more and more and more about our Old Testament Scripture. And hopefully one of these days, there will be a humbling in the academy where guys are going to go, what's more important is that this gets done, and it gets done, because what comes out of it is amazing. And as a serendipity, one of the guys that is probably today a leading voice in the Dead Sea Scroll studies is Dr. Kurt Nickham, who we've had come to ACU, from ACU many times to MAC to speak at our Insights, to speak in our summer series and things like that. He has published a book on the Dead Sea Scrolls and has actually done some of the translation work on it. In fact, I think the very first time I met him, he was a professor of New Testament at Oklahoma Christian University. And I had never met him before, but one of my friends was on faculty there, and he wanted me to meet Kurt. So I go into Kurt's office, and it's obvious that he is concentrating. He has got like 4 levels of magnifying glasses and lights and his own glasses, and he's looking at something. And I didn't know who he was, later on, I thought, I interrupted that guy while he was trying to, figure out what this scroll said, and I feel pretty bad about that. But yeah, Kurt, if you go to Amazon and look up Kurt Nickham, you can probably find his book fairly inexpensively and get it quickly on Amazon Prime. We get back in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, 1 through 18, practicing our righteousness, our acts of piety before men, if you want to read that text ahead of time. And we will see you. Next week will be the last class that I teach. After that, Norris will be teaching